Welcome to the first show of an action-packed doubleheader. I'll expand more in a second. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 198, part one on the March 200 of the Mike to New Haven podcast. If you haven't checked out episode 197, that was volume 22 of the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. Zach Goldfarb, who was with New York City EMS pre-merger with the FDNY in 1996, and upon the merger in 96 became a staff chief with them. A lot of good nuggets of information with him. He talked about even being in Woodstock in 1994, running the medical team over there. So it was an interesting chat with an interesting guy. So I'm sure this conversation will be the same. Like I said, first show of a doubleheader with my next guest, and I've been working on this show for a while, so I'm happy it's finally coming to fruition today. Who has spent over 4 decades working as a newsman, remaining a constant presence, I should say, in an industry of constant change. Having begun his career in college, he soon found himself in one of the three big networks in America, ABC News, of course, where then for the next 44 years he'd serve as a general assignment reporter, Washington correspondent, and most notably anchor of both Good Morning America and World News Tonight at separate times. He's currently the co-host of the Bookcase podcast with his daughter Kate, and that is one Charlie Gibson, who joins me now on the Mike to New Haven podcast. Charlie, welcome. How are you?
That was a very heavily produced beginning to your program, and as a Princeton graduate, showing pictures of New Haven is not particularly tasteful to me. Although I'm certainly glad that you didn't feature in that pictures of the Yale campus. I wouldn't have recognized it anyway. When my daughters were applying for college, I told them I would pay for any college they went to, with the exception of Yale. That's just a feeling that's engendered in people from Princeton all the time, and it's a great place. But I'm glad to see that it wasn't featured in your New Haven open.
No, and it was not. I think anybody from Princeton and Harvard feels the same way about Yale University. I never went to Yale. I went to the other college down the street, Gateway Community College, and we used to kid our counterparts in Yale. We're getting the same education as you guys for a heck of a lot cheaper. So that was the running joke with them. So I get where you're coming from. But welcome. So you grew up in Washington D.C. Tell me about those early years.
I did. I actually was born in Evanston, Illinois, and around Chicago until I was 12. My dad was going to have to retire from the company he was in, so he was able to work for the government till he was 70. So we moved to Washington, and that was probably one of the most fortuitous things that ever happened to me, because I just sort of got interested in politics. Living in Washington, it was sort of a part of the ethos. And I went to school with a bunch of politicians' kids, and that further engendered my interest in it. And really, my interest in the news business came from my dad. We every night would watch Huntley Brinkley, and on NBC, and he was a news junkie, and so was my mom. And at dinner every night, I was expected to know what had been in the Washington Post that day, the Washington Post and Times Herald, it was called then. Um, and I didn't have to recite, but it was going to be the topic of discussion every night at the dining room table, and that began it. And then when I had gone to public school in Evanston, and for reasons, my parents were old school, and Washington, D.C. schools had just desegregated. And my parents were very worried, as I say, old school, with old school attitudes. They were very worried about the Washington public school system just desegregated. And my dad went to the local junior high school. I've never actually told this story to anybody. Uh, Went to the local junior high school, which was just up the street, and asked, is there racial tension in the school with this new desegregation? And the principal, who was white uh, and was an athlete, he was a high school basketball referee, as high school principals, middle school principals tended to be, tend to have some sports connection. And he was white, and he said, "Mr. Gibson, I wouldn't send my kid here." And that was very sobering. Um, and so they applied me to private schools, which was something that my folks had never considered. And I applied to Sidwell Friend School, which is and I remember going for my interview. There was a senator in Connecticut, Thomas Dodd, who was under investigation at the time, and and my dad was bringing home copies of the Congressional Record and I was reading these hearings going on about Senator Dodd. And so when I went into the Sidwell Friend School interview, they asked me what I was reading, and I told them. And then I went home, and Dad said, "What kind of questions did they ask you?" And I said, "They asked me what I was reading." He said, "What'd you say?" I said, "Well, I said I'm reading the Congressional Record and Sports Illustrated." And Dad said, "You're in. You're going to get in with that. With that Catholicity of interest, you'll probably get admitted." And I did get admitted. I got admitted to a series of private schools. The other private schools said to me, "Because you've gone to public school, you're going to have to stay back a year." Sidwell said, "Don't worry about that." And so I went to Sidwell. Um, but that was it was a very dicey time in Washington early on in desegregation. Uh, the cabs were segregated. There was a black cab company and a white cab company. And Sidwell, when I went there, was segregated. And they, in the first year, second year, I guess I was there, they then admitted their first African American student, but they admitted by grade. They started in kindergarten and worked up, and there was one little boy who was the only black kid in Sidwell until I think he got to the fourth grade, and then they began to admit some more. Now there's good diversity in Sidwell Friends, I'm pleased to say, but in those days it was an all-white school where I went. It's an interesting thing, Mike. I never, in my entire educational experience, I never sat in a classroom with an American black student, ever. I grew up in Evanston until sixth grade. There's no diversity in that grade school I went to. Sidwell, through the grades that I was in until I graduated, was all white in my grades. And when I went to Princeton, there was one African American student, African American student in my class at Princeton. There were a number of African students, but no, and I sat in class, but never did I sit in the class with an American black student. And I graduated in 1965. It's amazing how different life is then. And I was sort of oblivious to all that. Martin Luther King's speech in 1963 was, taking place in my town, was a real eye opener for me. And there was a big fight over the local amusement park as to whether they would desegregate. Um, I came along at a time of transition. I don't apologize for it, but I'm not proud of it either.
We're talking with Charlie Gibson here on the Mike to New Haven podcast. For those of you who may want to submit a question to Charlie via the live chat, please fire away. Just a quick shout out to our friends who are watching. Andy's Randomness, Andrew Pollack has his name from Queens, but that's his YouTube channel name. Steve Zaslavsky, who is the Assistant Fire Commissioner here for the New Haven Fire Department. Christian Williams, Ruth Ann Griffin, Joe Maliga, and Bill Ryan, of course, a good friend of mine, retired NYPD first grade detective out of the Arson and Explosion Squad. So I guess, growing up in an environment like that, I imagine that was the baptism by fire, if you will, into journalism, because at the core of a journalist is the question, why? Why are things this way? Why do we have to view things this way? And so I guess being in an environment like that was so unique for your time, well, go ahead.
Well, it gave me an interesting background. When I first decided, and I came out of college, as I say, my mom and dad were news junkies, and so I thought this would be an interesting field to work in. I also got turned down at the law school that I wanted to attend. And I won't tell you which law school that was, but its name is spelled Yale, which has further endeared
Never heard of it.
That institution to me. They turned me down. As a matter of fact, I talked to my grades at Princeton were great, and I talked to the recruiter for the Yale Law School when he came to Princeton, and he said, "With all due respect, Mr. Gibson, I might suggest that you save your application fee." So that was a pretty good hint. Anyway, so I, as I say, with my folks as news junkies, I thought it would be wonderful to work in the profession. And I wasn't very good at punctuation, so I thought, well, newspapers are probably out. Little did I know that there were editors who punctuated for you, and I had worked in the college radio station, as you were nice enough to mention. And so I thought radio TV. So I applied to an internship program at Channel 7 in Washington, and they farmed me out to Lynchburg, Virginia, where I worked for 3 years. In those days, Lynchburg was a totally bigoted little community. And uh, and so it was a very interesting crucible in which to learn my craft, because desegregation was the story. The schools were being desegregated, much to the opposition of the white community in Lynchburg. They were blessed with a very forward-thinking chairman of the school board, who was the head of the GE plant in Lynchburg, and he was he was good at it. But the newspaper in Lynchburg would not publish a story about a black person. Would not. One of their photographers had been pushed around on the campus of the black high school. There was E.C. Glass, which was the white high school, Dunbar, which was the black high school. And so they stopped. You could buy a story. You could say Charlie Gibson, comma, a Negro, comma, was convicted. They would publish those stories, was convicted of a crime, etc. You could buy your birth announcement. You could buy your death announcement. But unless you were convicted of a crime, you would not appear in that paper. The Dunbar High School football games did not appear in that paper. There was the graduation of Dunbar High School was not covered by the paper. They would not publish a story about an African-American person. So, we young Turks come into WJLA, which was WLVA, which was the station there at Richmond, Virginia. And we started to cover the black community. And the newspapers called us. There was one editorial in the local newspaper called me a communist and a socialist and a whatever. And when I left Lynchburg, eventually I became somewhat controversial down in Lynchburg. And so the TV station, WJLA, WMAL then in Washington, called me back to work in Washington. And when I drove out of Lynchburg, I realized about 10 miles out of town that I had a flat tire. And when I got out to change the flat tire, I realized that all 4 tires had been slashed. We were a controversial, but it was a good place to learn my craft, because we covered I still think of the people in the black community there who cooperated with us, helped us, and we covered the white community, of course, as well. But we were something of a thorn in the side of the newspaper, I guess. And Jerry Falwell was there, and Jerry Falwell had just started all white Liberty College, and he had better television equipment for the Old Time Gospel Hour than we had in our station, and he wouldn't talk to us. We didn't exist as far as he was concerned. We'd call him for comments on this, that, or the other story. He wouldn't talk to us. And then when I got to Good Morning America, and we occasionally put Jerry Falwell on the air, I was his best friend. It was like all that history in Lynchburg didn't exist. It was an interesting relationship that we had with Jerry Falwell of the Old Time Gospel Hour. So it was, as I say, learning my craft and learning all of that, reporting on desegregation in Lynchburg was a good way to start out.
Well, let's go back for a second before I continue with your reporting career, because I believe you had a tenure in the Coast Guard. And it doesn't matter what branch of the military one may serve in, it is an eye-opening experience, nevertheless. Even if you never go out to a combat zone, just to be there is quite the experience in and of itself. So how do you think the Coast Guard tenure shaped your outlook, not only on your reporting at the time, but certainly on your life?
Well, it's an interesting question, Mike. When I came, because I didn't get into that law school, YALE,
Mm-hmm.
I had to go down and I had to re-register with the draft board when I came out of college. And so I did, and I had to change from a student deferment. I was 1A. And I went and I applied to all of the reserve programs, Marines, Air Force, Army, Navy, and the Coast Guard. And I got a call. I had a talk with the draft board lady when I went down to re-register, And we had a conversation. She asked me where I was going to college and all that. And she was a nice lady. And I re-registered. I was 1A. Anyway, I got a phone call. And about, I guess a month later. And she said to me, you need to do something if you want to go into the reserves because your draft notice is in the mail. And you will get it in 2 or 3 days. And you will have to report to such and such. I forgot where. And so I said to my dad, I'm about to get drafted. And he said, so where do you stand with these reserve programs? The Coast Guard had told me there was a 2-year waiting list. And so I wasn't going to get in there. And the Navy was a year. I had taken a test with the Air Force. They were going to make me a cook. And I would have given hundreds of Air Force cadets of ptomaine poisoning if I'd been a cook. So I signed up with the Marines. And I was to report. It was going to get me out of the draft, having to go into the military. That way I was going to go into the Marines in a 6-month reserve program. Signed up. I was headed down, and the night before I was to report to 8th and I Southeast at the Marine Barracks, my dad said to me, what, because I opposed the war, and I had been marching in anti-war protests, etc. And my dad said to me, what would be the best service that, as far as you were concerned, that would allow you to take care of your military obligation and not violate your feelings about the war? And I said, Dad, I guess the Coast Guard, but there's a 2-year waiting list for the Coast Guard. And he said, well, on the way down to 8th and I, to the Marine Barracks, why don't you just stop by the Coast Guard recruiting station, see where you stand on the waiting list? I said, Dad, it was just a month ago that I put in my name. Anyway, I stopped in. Chief Vernon I. Suggs, who I have never seen before and I have never seen since, was there at the recruiting station. And I told him I was headed down to 8th and I, Southeast, to the Marine Barracks. And he said, sit down, have a cup of coffee. And I said, okay, I don't have to be there for an hour. And I don't like coffee, but I wasn't going to say no to him. And we talked about the military, and then he asked me, what do you think of the war? And that was a moment. And I said to him, Chief Suggs, it's probably not politic to say this to you, but I oppose it. I think it's wrong. I don't believe in the domino theory. I have friends who are serving in Vietnam. I had one friend who was killed. And I just don't think it's right. I don't think that we should be in this war. And I've been actually demonstrating against it. And he said, oh, interesting. And we had the sort of philosophical conversation about the war. And then I said, Chief, it's time for me to go. I got to get down to the Marine Barracks. You haven't told me where I stand on the waiting list. He said, I'll make you number 1 if you want to go. And I said, yes. And that's how I got into the Coast Guard. Because I didn't believe in the war and I thought it was wrong. And yet, in 6 years in the reserves of the Coast Guard, I came to have great respect for that service. And I have a very ambivalent feeling. I have great respect for people who serve in the military. And I think we treated shabbily soldiers when they came back from Vietnam. But it was an eye-opening experience for me. And I could tell you a bunch of stories about the Coast Guard, but most of them involve profanity. So I'll be good.
We'll hold off on that. This is Charles.
Not that I would use bad words about the Coast Guard. It was just the Coast Guard chiefs with whom I served mostly had very colorful language. I had
mouths like sailors, shall we say?
Mouths like sailors. I had one chief who could not get through a sentence without using a really terrible word. He was a very colorful guy. I loved him, but it was a very eye-opening experience for me.
We're talking with Charles Gibson here in the Mike the Native podcast. This is episode 198, part 1. Before I continue, and I do want to ask you about a notable story that you were in the Washington area for. I do have a question here in the chat, and as I promised, if you guys in the audience had one, I'd read it. Joe Maliga wants to know, scariest, I mean, you kind of talked about it earlier in Lynchburg, but scariest reporting job that you were ever on?
I never, that's interesting. I never felt concerned about my own safety. I did not go to Vietnam as a reporter, and I regret that I did not. I wish I had. Um, I was in the war zone before the first Gulf War, and but I never, with one exception, and that was covering the anti-war protests in Washington in during the Vietnam period. I was back working for Channel 7 then. And I always tell people I have come to have great respect for tear gas. 3 times I got tear gassed. The first time I walked around a corner and there had just been some tear gas shot at protesters, and boy, I was down on my stomach before I knew what had happened. That stuff gets you. Um, but I never felt afraid for my own safety. Even covering 9/11, when we were, but I was just covering it. It was that had already happened. I no, I never felt. I've never been. I was going to use the word scared. That's probably too strong. Um, I was in Israel once when we were ducking. When there were air raid sirens going off all the time, and there were rockets landing around us. But never. I just, for some reason, it's just not in my DNA, I guess.
And Steven Zaslavsky wants to know: did you ever report on the Gotti trials?
No, no. I uh, never got into any mafia stuff.
I don't blame you. Our friend John Miller did, and he made it out okay. And shout out to John; he just retired from the NYPD. Good for him.
I watched your podcast with John. I love that guy. He
He's
was
great.
a wonderful reporter for ABC, and he became anchor of 2020, and he gave it all up to go work for the police department. John loved to play cop,
Yep.
and he's a very very bright, wonderful guy.
Yep.
Colorful, and I urged him to stay at ABC, but he was too interested in going off and playing.
Uh, there's a quick, just before I continue with you, there's a quick story on him from my buddy Scott Wagner, who's a retired NYPD homicide detective and hostage negotiator. There used to be 3 different police departments in New York, as you remember. There was the housing police, and Scott was with them before the merger. And one day he's walking with his partner and they're on their way to question somebody, and John pulls up. And it's this decked out car with all the battering, the ram bar that they have on the front and all these cool lights. And they're thinking it's one of the guys they work with. The window rolls down and it's John. And Scott looks at John and says, "John, can we ride with you? Because your car's a heck of a lot nicer than the crap that we got." So that's a good little story about John. But with you, I mean, in the 1970s, 73 into 74, 74 is really when it became a national story. You were there for Watergate. So, I mean, you had come from Lynchburg and covering that. And, that was obviously an eye opener, as we discussed earlier. And here you are with a president that was, and I'm not taking sides here. It's just the fact of the matter, was a crook. And here was not only just a president, but such a colorful, unique character when you look back on somebody like Richard Nixon. Being there for that during that time, tell me about your personal experience, if any, with Watergate.
Well, let me go back a little bit,
Mhm.
as long as we're on the subject of Nixon, and I'll take you to 1960
Mhm.
when I was still in high school. And I lived in Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and 2 blocks away was a Senator John Kennedy from Massachusetts. And he gets elected president over Richard Nixon. And I sort of wanted Nixon to win, mostly because Pat and Julie Nixon were at Sidwell at the time. And I thought it would be kind of cool to have the president's daughters in my school. But if anybody's old enough to remember, and you're not, Mike, but Kennedy would come out on the doorstep of his house at 33rd and N Street in Georgetown, and he would announce his cabinet. And I cut school one day because I had this idea of wanting to be a journalist. I cut school one day and went down and stood at 33 and N, hoping that the president would come out that day and maybe I would get to look at him. And there were only 3 networks then. There was no cable. NBC, ABC, CBS. There was 3 cameras outside, across the street, across N Street, and maybe 4 or 5 print reporters, the wire services, New York Times, Washington Post. But it was a very small. There was no Secret Service all over the place. Today they'd have 4 blocks away cordoned off so that you couldn't get near it. So I was standing there, and across the street lived Judge Gerhard Gazelle, he was a federal judge who eventually got involved in some of the Watergate cases, and Hugh Scott, who was the Republican leader of the Senate from Pennsylvania. They had houses right across the street from Kennedy's. Mrs. Gazelle came out that day and gave us cookies. It was amazing how informal everything was. And then right across the street from me was David Bruce, his name was, and he was rumored to be the Secretary of State under Kennedy. And I'm doing my homework in my bedroom one day, and in high school homework, because it's 1960 and I'm still in high school. And the motorcade pulls up at about midnight in front of David Bruce's house. And I thought, ooh, my first scoop, David Bruce is going to be Secretary of State. No. I watched John Kennedy, the president-elect, walk into the Bruce house. He was there to tell Bruce he wasn't getting the job. It was going to go to Dean Rusk. So if I had called some news service and said, I got a scoop for you, the president's in David Bruce's house, I would have been all wrong. He wasn't there to it. Anyway, then life goes on, and I'm back in Washington now working for a news service. I wasn't at ABC then. I was at a news service. And the Watergate trials came about. And I was, for that news service, which was a fledgling news service, long since disappeared. It was supplying local television stations with pieces to go into their newscast. But I was there competing with Sam Donaldson and others. I wasn't competing; I wasn't in their league, but I was there, in the same scrums and in the House office building where the hearings were taking place, the House Judiciary Committee hearings. And Sam and I Sam came up to me a couple of times and said, I saw your piece. It was on Channel 5 last night in Washington. And you did this and this. Why'd you do that? Because I didn't think that was and we would have discussions about our pieces that we had run. And Sam has an interesting reputation, but he's one of the nicest guys you would ever want to know. He was a mentor to me. And Sam said to ABC, you ought to hire this guy. And so I got hired away, having covered Watergate and those House Judiciary Committee hearings. And then afterwards covering the trials of John Mitchell, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mardian, and Parkinson, who are the two names that are not very well remembered. And then later John Connolly's trial for financial improprieties. All of that for TVN, which was this news service that I worked for. And that was, being able to compete with the big guys was very good for me. And as I say, Sam recommended me to ABC, and ABC hired me, and the rest is history. But Sam was wonderful to talk to and just bounce things off of. Why did you construct your piece this way? Why did I construct my piece that way? Sam was like Diogenes going through life with the lantern, looking for the perfect piece in a newscast. Sam was always questioning what he did, and getting to know him, and that experience with Watergate was which eventually led me to ABC.
And what's interesting is that right after you got to ABC, you got to cover Gerald Ford's White House. Now, looking back in American history, and some may beg to differ, and that's fine. He's kind of the president people, at least in recent history, people look back and say, oh, yeah, I forgot. Yeah, he was in the White House for a little bit because of the circumstances regarding Nixon's departure and then Jimmy Carter coming in and everything involving that. But just to be around him, and he lived a long life. He passed away at the age of 93 in 2006. What was he like to cover?
Well, I was the junior reporter at the White House when I eventually got there. I had been general assignment for a couple of years, and then they put me in the White House. There were 3 ABC reporters. I was clearly number 3. Tom Gerald, his name was the lead ABC correspondent. Ann Compton was number 2. I was number 3. But I came to have great affection for the Ford family. And I think, Mike, Gerald Ford is a very interesting and important historical figure, even though he served in the presidency unelected, never elected. There was William Henry Harrison, I guess, had a shorter term than Ford, but he was the only unelected president we've ever had. And I thought he was a tremendous antidote to to Nixon. He may not have been brilliant. He was a congressman who had served, had done his time in the Congress, had come up through the ranks, and was the Republican leader in the House, uh, replacing Spiro Agnew. I'm sorry, that was Rockefeller placed Agnew, but he was there, um, and he was. I'm trying to go back over the history of it now, but he was there. He was a calming influence when he became president, and I sort of, when people would ask me explain Joe Biden to them, I would say I think Biden is sort of in the Gerald Ford mold, that he is coming in after a very, very controversial and tumultuous presidency, Nixon, and then obviously Trump in the Biden case. And I think he's going to be a calming influence on the country. And so, no matter what you may think of Joe Biden, I think Ford and he have both been wonderful antidotes to tumultuous periods in American politics. Whether Biden's going to go on and be president again, or who knows, but I think Jerry Ford did a wonderful job in sort of calming the waters politically after Nixon, who, as you say, uh, had had his Shakespearean flaws.
No, of course. And what's interesting is that sometimes the best news is no news. And I think if you look back on Ford's tenure, the only notable story you can recall is, I think there was an assassination plot against him that did not come to fruition. Thankfully, that was thwarted, but that had nothing to do with him as much as it had to do with somebody who wasn't all there upstairs. And then, of course, there is the infamous headline during the financial crisis in New York, which is more of a New York story. Ford, the city dropped dead, but that's about it. There wasn't anything groundbreaking that you look back on and say, yeah, wow, what a story that was with him. As you said, it was kind of a calming period.
No, there was some inflation there. It got worse in Carter's years, but uh, Ford started a program called Whip Inflation Now. It was not a notable presidency in terms of what happened. It was, as you say, I think very wisely, it was a notable presidency in what didn't happen. You didn't wake up every morning thinking, "Oh my Lord, what has the president done today?" It's the same a little bit like Biden. You don't wake up in the morning and think, "Oh Lord, what has Trump done?" Um, so it's as I say, just a calming influence. And I don't carry water for any political candidate. As a matter of fact, I've said this a number of times. It's very controversial in my own family, but I didn't until I retired, Mike. I never voted, and I didn't vote because of Ford. Because I did cover the Ford campaign in 1976. I came to like the family very much. I Mrs. Ford I thought was wonderful. I thought the president was a really nice guy, and I was sad when he lost. And I thought, you can't be that way. You can't get emotionally involved in a candidate. So I stopped voting, so that I wouldn't be emotionally invested in any candidate. And I didn't vote. And my children thinks that is heresy. And they were every election day they would say, "Dad, what you're doing is wrong," or not doing is wrong. But I just felt I didn't want to make up my mind that I favored one candidate or another to the extent that I could avoid it.
It reminds me of sports journalism in a sense because I'm friendly with Mike Lupica, and we were talking about this. Mike Lupica, the great longtime New York Daily News writer, of course, and the old adage about sports writing, there's no cheering in the press box. It's kind of the same
Right.
thing. You root. He told me you root for good stories. You cover people that are interesting. Yes, you root for good stories. You never root for a specific outcome.
I
So
think
I think
that's a very good way to put it.
yeah, it's very applicable in that sense. And of course, it's a great analogy from a great writer. So you did cover the House for a while for the majority of the 80s, I would say 81 to 87. Now, it feels like, I mean, granted, there's greater offices in terms of rank and structure, but it feels like the majority of what really affects society, rightly or wrongly, seems to happen there. And a lot of people wonder how that process works. They have their opinions on it strongly, one way or the other, that's for sure. But to actually be there day to day, what went into that? What was that like for you?
Two things. One, the House was worked in those days. It doesn't work now. Congress is a non-functional body, and I say that as somebody who loves the House of Representatives, uh, because those 435 people are, to some extent, to a large extent, representative of the country. I always used to say there's about 100 really smart people there. There's about 100 people who aren't so smart, and there's about 235 who are in the middle. But that's very representative of the country. And out of that came wisdom. And I was blessed covering the House. First of all, Reagan was president, so the White House was in Republican hands. The Senate was in Republican hands for most of the time that I covered the House. And the House was in Democratic hands. Tip O'Neill was the Speaker. And so the House was sort of the antidote to what was happening in the White House and in the Senate. And so we got Tip on the air many days as the sort of countervailing speaker to the president. And also the House had pictures in those days. They had cameras in the House, and there were no cameras in those days in the Senate. And that gave me the ABC does not have a House correspondent now full time. They have somebody covering Congress, but it's not a sole House reporter. And the House doesn't get on the air much, other than the fact that they haven't done anything, which is anyway. Nancy Pelosi is somewhat controversial as we talk. She's in Taiwan, but other than that, the House doesn't get much coverage. But in those days, it did. It was a wonderful place to work. And then I was sort of backed up. Sam was in the White House. Brit Hume was covering the Senate. Sam wasn't going anywhere, so we weren't going to transition anytime soon. So I started when I could to do some anchoring. Good Morning America, if you watch that program, the Today Show does the same. At 25 minutes after the hour, they cut out and go to local news.
Mm-hmm.
And in those days, while local news was going on, ABC and Good Morning America actually had somebody doing a newscast for stations that weren't doing local news at that hour, at 25 minutes after. I don't know who was carrying it, probably some station in Ottumwa, Iowa or something. I know, but I went in and I did that. And then I'd go off to the House. I did those little 5-minute newscasts, probably for nobody. Nobody was watching, but I did them. And Joan London took notice of it. And when David Hartman retired, Joan said, this guy Gibson has a nice way about him. I don't know what it was she saw. I'm forever grateful to her for it. So I was one of the people who tried out for Good Morning America. And because I was going to get stuck in the reporting hierarchy behind Sam and behind Brit, I thought, yeah, if you're willing to consider me for the GMA job, yeah, great. Phil Buth was the executive in charge of Good Morning America. And he said to me, you're on the list. You're one of the people we're considering. If you lose interest in us, give me a call. And if I lose interest in you, I'll call you. Well, neither one of those phone calls ever took place. And I tried out for a couple of weeks here and there, and eventually got the job. It was not something that I had ever thought about, aspired to, but it came into my lap. Phil Buth is one of those people who came into my life and totally changed the direction of it. And I'd never met the guy before. He's a wonderful old crusty guy. He's in his 90s now, lives down in Florida. Still in touch with him on occasion. He changed my life. And I went up to New York, succeeded David Hartman. And for 19 years, I had the privilege, and I really considered it a privilege and an honor, 4 times a day, every half hour, to say, Good Morning America. I think it's the best named program in the history of television. And we got to be at people's breakfast tables. And as a result, I always say as a result of that show, because it's a very personal connection that you work out with viewers, much more so than it's a very personal time of day. I always say the beds aren't made, the dishes aren't done, the kids are running around like banshees. And here I am, this chirpy twerp sitting on a couch with a tie on saying, let me into your house. At this very personal time of day. So people looked at you personally and looked at you not just as a reporter, but as a friend. I always used to say I have millions and millions of friends that I don't know. But doing that program was really wonderful experience. I'll never have anything like it. The hours are terrible, obviously, but I would get up at 3:20 every morning, and that was hell. But anyway. other than that, it was a great program to do, and I loved it. And I had a chance to do it. I really did two different programs because it was a different show with Joan, which I did for 11 years, and then 8 more years with Diane.
Right.
And they had a different approach. I just was there basically to get them both coffee.
I have a question here before I delve further into your GMA years. It comes from Christian Williams. He says, do you think it would be better if the House or the Senate got its correspondent today on a full-time basis?
Yes. Yes, I except that the Congress is non-functional now, and it drives me crazy. In the days when Tip was Speaker and Bob Michael was the minority leader in the House, and two men for whom I have great respect, both passed away now. When Tip ran, the Democrats ran roughshod over the Republicans. The Republicans had a very small representation in the House. But the Democrats, when a bill was coming up, and if a bill came up and Tip was in favor of it, and Dan Rostenkowski, who was head of Ways and Means, and I forgot who was head of the Rules Committee at the time, the Democrats basically were setting the agenda for what would happen in the House. But they would go to Bob and say, "What do you need? We got a Social Security bill here. What are there 3 amendments that would help your people? What will they be?" That kind of cooperation ended with Newt Gingrich, who basically came in and wanted to explode the place, and his tactics were successful, unfortunately. But now the members don't live in Washington. They don't go to soccer games with with the parents of other kids with whom they might serve in Congress. I remember doing an interview with Evan Bayh when he retired after 2 terms in the Senate. From Indiana, and his dad, Birch Bayh, had obviously been in the Senate in Washington. And Evan Bayh said to me, when I was a kid, we would always have people from the other party over to the house for dinner, and we would talk legislation in those days and that kind of thing. Or I would hear conversations about legislation over the dining room table. He said, I haven't had a member of the other party in my house in 12 years here because everybody goes home. We're here Tuesday to Thursday, and then everybody goes home to try to raise money for their next election campaign. He said, we haven't had a full Senate meeting of both parties. We have individual party caucuses where basically we throw red meat on the table about the other party and how terrible they are. The spirit of cooperation is gone in the Congress, and I don't know how we get it back. We desperately need to get it back. There needs to be compromise. There needs to be greater centrism. There just needs to be two bodies that work, and as a result, I think that the way that Congress doesn't work anymore has had terrible effects on the country.
Talking with Charlie Gibson here on the Mike the New Haven podcast. This is episode 198, part 1. Happy to have him here. He is also the co-host of the Bookcase podcast with his daughter, Kate Gibson. Now, getting into your GMA years, it's interesting about a morning show, both on the local level and on the national level, because you want to walk that fine line. There are some morning shows, and I'm not knocking either formula, it's just the way it is, that it's strictly soft news. It's not a serious show. It's more lighthearted, playing around for however long the show may be. And there's the other shows that tend to be more hard news during that format, waking you up, letting you know what's going on. But there's a balance that you want to walk to with the morning show in which you're not too serious, but also not too goofy either. And you obviously come from a very serious journalistic background. You had established yourself long before going to GMA. So getting there, working those 11 years with Joan, and of course, again with Diane, tell me about how, both times with Joan and later with Diane, you both as a pair tried to successfully walk that tightrope.
Well, I always felt somebody sat me down once, actually a very notable producer in television sat me down when I first got the job and said, you need to be the alpha anchor. You need to be the male needs to be the predominant host of the morning show. I said, I disagree totally. I think it's equal, men, women. I always used to say people look at Joan, but occasionally listen to me. That's very nice. I thought we were brother and sister as opposed to anything else in that role. So I used to say there's a sort of a continuum, Mike, between what people need to know and what people want to know. This being sort of pop culture news and this being hard news. And I certainly agreed. Nightline was more on the hard news end. Uh, Evening news, obviously, more on the hard news end. And Good Morning America was further over on the perhaps on the pop culture, what people want to know kind of thing. Because you're not ready to to have hard edged debates at 7 o'clock in the morning. Having said that, the first half hour is still quite substantive of GMA, and into the second half hour as well. It was a sort of a fine balance. I the only thing I said when I went to work there was I'm not going to put on a chef's hat. I'm not going to put on an apron. And although Peter Jennings, Peter Jennings used to say to me when I'd go over to World News, he'd say, "Are you comfortable here? There's no kitchen on this set." Um, Thanks, Peter. It was his way of getting a little dig in. But I was very comfortable with GMA. I'm a little uncomfortable with it now. I think it's gone over to softer news. But George is a terrific journalist, and Robin has good journalistic chops. Um, so I still defend it as I say. I think the first half hour is quite substantive, and often the second half hour. The second hour is when Kate, my daughter Kate, and I have got 6 appearances on GMA a year to do stories that arise out of our podcast and sort of plug the podcast. Um, and we're in the second hour, and I sort of think we're in the soft hour. Uh, but it's I think it's still my big complaint actually, Mike, is the show is Good Morning America, and they don't get out on the road enough. We used to do wonderful bus trips across the country, and we would do shows from. We must have done shows from 50, 60 different areas around the country. Um, and we had a wonderful reporter, Steve Fox, who was out doing pieces in each of the states and local communities and local stories and that were big. And when we would go on the road, the lead story on the road was always what's the big story in that community from which we're broadcasting. I always felt very comfortable with that, um, and now it's good. I feel like it's become Good Morning Times Square, and not Good Morning America. And I wish they would get out on the road more because we would go to a town. I remember going in. We were in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, and our buses had just pulled in, um, and people were running up saying, "What do you think of our town? What do you think of our town?" People have great local pride about their communities, and we were able to reflect that to some extent when we traveled the show, and I wish they would do that more.
There were so many notable stories there during your time in GMA. There was the Gulf War, of course, in the early 90s, 1990 into 1991. There was Nixon's death in 1994, Princess Diana, John F. Kennedy Jr., of course, the Clinton craziness there in 97, 98, 99. But, you know, there was a news story that quite literally came to your front door, and that was, as you said earlier, with 9/11. On the air that morning, first you get a report of an explosion at the World Trade Center. You see the pan out to the tower on fire. And then as Don Dahler's telling you what he's seeing, you see that shot of the second plane coming in and smashing the South Tower. Now, first, before you're a journalist, before you're anything, no matter your profession, you're a human being. You've lived in this city long enough. You love this city. And you're seeing it under attack. And you're seeing in that moment when that plane smashed into the South Tower, the deaths of thousands of people. And calmly, along with Diane, along with Peter Jennings and John Miller, you guys had to broadcast the great one of the true defining moments in this country's history, in the world's history, really. Getting through that, being on the air, and I don't know how else to ask the question. How did you not go into shock? And how emotionally did you not break down, especially as the towers came down? You saw that dust cloud, knowing you just watched thousands of innocent people lose their lives.
By the time the towers came down, Peter was in the chair, and I was off elsewhere pursuing the same story, obviously. But we were in a commercial break when the first plane hit, and Stu Schwartz, who was our control room producer, whose daughter Dana Bash, by the way, is a wonderful reporter now on CNN. But Stewie Schwartz said in our ears, "Something has happened at the World Trade Center. We have a traffic camera, WABC traffic camera, poised on the tower. Um, Something may have hit the towers. You're on the air. Go." And all of a sudden, we were on the air. And it didn't take more than 30 seconds to realize that this was not a normal fire in that building. So we went to special report, which simply means that we were then on the, instead of Good Morning America just being on the air on the East Coast and the Midwest, we were on the air across the entire country because it wasn't yet 7 o'clock in the Mountain Time Zone or West Coast. And we were just trying to figure it out along with everybody. But Mike, you go into reporter mode. The emotion didn't really hit that morning. We were writing madly notes to people saying, when was the earlier bombs found in the basement of the World Trade Center? When did a plane hit the Empire State Building? And then the second plane came into view, and it was the South Tower. So the plane disappeared on the traffic camera. You saw it disappear behind the North Tower, and then you saw the flames shoot out on the other side. And Diane and I had different reactions. I don't know if she'd had my reaction, but I wish I'd had hers, because her reaction was so human. She said, "Oh my God." And my reaction was, now we know what's going on. The United States is under attack. But you sort of go into a who, what, why, where, when mode, the questions that reporters have to keep in mind. And we stayed on the air for another half hour, 40 minutes in the special report. And then Peter got into place. And Diane went off to where she went off to, and I went off to where I went. It was the next day, really, that the emotion hit me. We had worked all day long, and you didn't have time really to think about all of it, but trying to book guests and what are we going to do, and da-da-da-da. And we decided we would go on, instead of at 7, we'd go on at 6, and we would go on for the whole country, because news at that point had taken air through the entire network. We were doing 24 hours of broadcasting. And so we went on the air at 6, and we were going to be on the air till noon when GMA goes off the air on the West Coast. And because it's 9 o'clock there. Anyway. So we were going to do 6 hours of broadcasting. So we decided we would move a table into the middle of the studio, and it would be Diane and me at the breakfast table, sharing your breakfast table, trying to find out stuff as you did. We had reporters at every one of the local hospitals that morning, the next morning, on the 12th of September. And there was no reason to have them there, although we didn't realize it till we got on the air. There were no people injured. It was binary. You lived or you died. And I remember that, realizing that and thinking, oh, this is so horrible. And walking into the studio on that morning, just before 6 o'clock, that's when the emotion really hit me. And I said to myself, you will never do anything more important than what you're going to do this morning in terms of your professional career. A. B, your entire professional life has been a preparation for this moment. Because as shaken up as the country was, what attitude, what demeanor Diane and I projected was probably more important than who we had as guests. All the morning shows were going to have the same guests. We're going to have Giuliani, we're going to have this, we're going to have that, we're going to have people from the fire department. But how we approach this, and I thought, if I start crying on the air, which is very possible, it was not the thing to do. So Diane and I had a talk. I said to her, if you start crying, I'll pick it up. If I start crying, please, you pick it up. And for the next couple of months, that was sort of our modus operandi. That's the way we reacted to it. It was very sobering, and I still get bottled up a little bit when I go back and think about those days.
The New York Times had a series from late 2001 until about early 2002, I guess after the recovery efforts ended. And it was called, if you remember, A Nation Challenged. And I think that those 3 words just about sums it up. And there's so many stories. This show, even though I do news interviews like today, I do a lot of NYPD, FDNY interviews.
Yeah, you do.
And talking with those gentlemen, even though I was only 1 year old when this happened, I always say I could close my eyes and I could picture myself there, because of not only being there, as they were, but also the friends that they would see for the last time. One of the stories that always sticks out that I always tell is one of my friends from the bomb squad, Detective Kevin Barry, standing at a street corner, I guess at Church and Vesey, and he sees his friends from the emergency service unit, which works very closely with the bomb squad, coming down the street. One of the cops in that circle of E-men, as they call the emergency cops, is John Delara. And Kevin used to be in emergency service, so he said to John, "Hey, John, how you doing?" And John looks up at Kevin and kind of goes, as if to say, he points up at the scene, and he's rolling his eyebrows like, "I don't know what we're getting into." And Kevin's like, "Yeah, I've been there." And as Kevin told me, he's like, "Mike, that was the last time I saw him."
Yeah.
He went in there and he rescued a lot of people, but he didn't. John Delara did not make it out that day. But I think the best, just to close out on that particular topic, some of the best reporting that's been done, at least in the 21st century, was done in those months afterward. The human stories, the stories, of course, on what happened, who was responsible, yes, that too, but the stories of humanity, of decency, and what people decided to do in those days afterwards.
We
To
were
profile that was incredible.
we were united as a country. Um, Living in New York, which has a sort of a rough edge reputation,
Yeah,
in the years following that, New York, New York got sort of a softness about the business of living, and it was a different atmosphere, and government was different, and the congressmen standing out on the steps and all singing "America the Beautiful," and I so wish that kind of unity. We're so divided now as a country, and and we weren't in those days. It was there was a unity of emotion and feeling, and now even the how we treat the first responders has become a political issue. Why should there be any question that they deserve every kind of consideration that we could give them? Because and the I look at the pictures of the firemen who were just charging into the building, uh, not knowing what they were going into, and but that was their duty, and that's where they went. And God bless every one of those people. Um, it's just it's the fact that we are so divided now, and we were united then. Um, this country, and I remember thinking all of those weeks, we're going to get through this as a country. We are too strong. We are When we unite, there's just no way that anybody can defeat us. And I don't feel that now, and I wish that kind of feeling of unity could be re-engendered in the country. It's what I miss.
A little aside, Chipper Jones, the Hall of Fame third baseman for the Atlanta Braves, he said, when I knew New York was back to being New York when I came in to play the Mets at Shea and they started booing me again." That was my cue. I'm like, all right, we're back to normal.
Met fans, parenthetically, are taught booing in the sixth grade. That's
Yes.
something that
And so are Yankee
they
fans
do.
too. I can attest because I am one as a Yankee fan. We are taught that too. So moving ahead,
I'm a
Brad.
Washington Nats fan, by the way.
Oh, today's a tough day for you, I imagine.
Juan Soto's been traded.
Yes, to the Padres.
Yeah, he's going to San Diego along with Josh Bell. Yeah.
Yeah. And you had Max Scherzer pitch well against you guys last night. You got DeGrom today. You got a World Series. You got a World Series a few years ago, at least.
I will, as bad as the Nats are now, I will always have 2019.
Exactly.
And I'll tell you a quick story about that. I've gotten to know just slightly Mike Rizzo, who is the general manager of the Washington Nationals, who traded Soto today. I wish he hadn't, but anyway. And if you'll remember, the Nats won the first two games in Houston, and then they came up to Washington. I went to all three games in Washington, third, fourth, and fifth games. They lost all three.
Yeah.
And as we're walking out of the fifth game, and my heart is in my shoes. I just couldn't believe we could go back to Houston and win game 6 and 7. And I saw Mike Rizzo, and I said, "Oh, Mike, this is bad." And he said, "Don't be down, Charlie. Don't be down. We got him right where we want him. Plus, which, how can you feel bad? We're in the World Series." And I thought, yeah, that's exactly the right attitude to have, Mike. And of course, we went down. Howie Kendrick hit the great home run, and we won the 7th game. It was wonderful, and everything after that is gravy, as far as I'm concerned. We won the World Series in 2019.
This is another story I tell. So I'm a Yankees, Rangers, Knicks, Giants fan. I've seen the Giants win twice. The Yankees haven't won since '09. I've never seen a Rangers Stanley Cup because I wasn't around in '94, and the Knicks, forget about it. But with the Yankees, '09 Game 6, because you realize just how hard it is to get there and how hard it is to get back. I was begging my mom. It was a school night. I was 9 years old at the time. Mom, please let me stay up. I knew they were going to win that night. There was no doubt in my mind they were going to win. They were at home. They were facing Pedro Martinez. It was too poetic. And sure enough, they did win. But I was begging her to let me stay up that night, and she wouldn't budge. She's like, "You're going to give me problems in the morning. You're not going to want to get up. You're grumpy in the morning. I know." You said, "I promise. I'll do whatever you want." I was willing to do every chore under the sun. She didn't. I didn't get the chance to see it that night in person when they won. And I thought, okay, they'll be back next year. I'll see it next year. They have not been back in 13 years. I'm still mad at my mom about that. That she didn't let me stay up for that Game 6.
You got a real good shot this year, and Aaron Judge is unbelievable.
Yes.
What he's doing.
Yes, he is.
Yeah, it's still the greatest game in the world to my mind. I love it, and I still, I must admit, as bad as the Nats are, and they are headed for many more than 100 losses this year. Yeah. I still tune in, but I loved watching Josh Bell, and I loved watching Juan Soto, and I wish they kept him. Anyway,
Bob Ryan of the Boston Globe, who's also a friend of mine, he said on this show, it's the greatest game that mortal minds ever invented, and he's right. Yeah. He's absolutely right. So just a quick note on your career, and it's been the hours flown by with you. You did anchor in your last few years there at ABC on a full-time basis, the nightly news, and it was tough because you're walking into that studio after Peter Jennings. There's no replacing Peter Jennings, who passed away in 2005 after a battle with lung cancer. There's no filling those shoes, and you didn't try to, but just those years anchoring, a different shift from what you were doing in the morning. Tell me about your approach to rightfully carrying on what Peter had left behind.
Well, I was going to retire as Good Morning America host. I'd done it 19 years. I figured I got 3 or 4 more years, and then I'm out of here. My wife had retired. She wanted a playmate, and I wanted. There was lots of life to live, and then I remember the night I was sitting home and I heard Peter. There was something in his throat, and he was having trouble getting the copy out and speaking, and I thought, oh, this is trouble. And sure enough, I was privy to the information that Peter had cancer before it was made public. But and so there was a brief interim where after Peter died, where Elizabeth Vargas and Bob Woodruff were doing the show, and then Bob got hurt, and Elizabeth got pregnant, and all of a sudden I was there, and people would come up to me and say, you're now the figurehead of heading ABC News, and you need your own staff at World News. You need to get your own people in place. And I thought, no, that's exactly what I don't want to do, because the staff was a time of tumult at ABC, and we needed to calm the waters. It was a Jerry Ford time. We needed to calm the waters. And so the staff was wonderful. They were very loyal to Peter. Peter's reputation, Peter's legacy was very much a part of World News, but they transferred their loyalties, and I had a wonderful 4 years working with them. And I always knew I was a transitional figure at World News, that I would, Peter was there for 20 some years. I couldn't do that. And I did want to retire. I was ready to retire. Doing 19 years of getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning takes its toll. So I did it for 4 years. I loved it. I kept thinking, I wish my dad was able to watch this, because of those days when we used to sit and watch Huntley Brinkley. And it was a great privilege to do it. And so I had 4 years, and we had some good stories. And we had arguably the most interesting election, I think, or one of the most interesting elections of my lifetime. And I got to do election night. One story, the first election night I had was 2006. And it was an off-year election. And I had studied, and I knew the Senate races backwards and forwards. And there were about 80 House races that I had memorized. And I was ready to do election night. But I was nervous. And a wonderful guy, Dick Wald, who so recently passed away, Dick Wald came into me. He was an advisor at, I think, the ABC News at the time, came into the newsroom about an hour from air, and he said, "Are you nervous?" And I said, "I'm well prepared, Dick, I'm well prepared." And he said, "But are you nervous?" And I said, Sure. I've never been the guy on election night before. And I election nights on a network are great. And, and he said, "Well, if it makes you feel any better, on the first election you did, Peter Jennings at this hour was in the bathroom throwing up." And that somehow that just calmed me. And then we had 2008, and I never thought growing up that I would see the election of an African American black man. And I was so proud of the country. I carried no water. I love John McCain. I actually thought he would have been a pretty good president. But it was a great story, as you say. It's the story, as Mike Lupica quoted it. It's Barack Obama was an incredible story, and I remember, and then again before that election, Dick Wald came to me and said, "Obama's going to get elected tonight," and I said, "Yes, it looks that way." And he said, "What's going to be your call?" And I looked at him and said, "What do you mean call?" And he said, "Well, like Al Michaels, in the 1980 Olympics, do you believe in miracles?" Well, I wasn't going to say that, needless to say, but I remember for the last 15 minutes before we went on the air thinking, what am I going to say at 11 o'clock when the California polls close? And at that point, Obama will probably have 270 electoral votes. What are you going to say? And so I thought about it a little bit. And so I remember saying that I've forgotten 200 and how many years ago, in our great documents, we had declared that all men are created equal. And that's what our founding documents say. And so I said, we haven't done such a good job making sure that that's the case. But tonight is a big step in that direction. And that was the election, I think, of my lifetime. Some are still to come. I hope many more elections still to come. But it was the election, certainly the greatest election that I would have a chance to do. And that was a great story. And it was an honor to be in the chair that night with Diane and George Stephanopoulos. And then inauguration and that incredible crowd that gathered on the inauguration day for Barack Obama. And then another year, and I was ready to step down.
Before I get to the concluding segment, of course, I don't want to gloss over completely. I've mentioned it a few times, of course, your podcast with your daughter, Kate. It's called The Bookcase. Tell us about it. What's it about?
She called me about a year ago and she said, "Dad, get off your butt. Let's get you working again. We should do a podcast on the subject of books because we talk. We talk about books all the time." And she said, "Would you be interested in doing that with me?" She was unemployed at the time, and she reads voraciously, and she's very smart. And so I said, "Sure, yeah, let's do it." I had to call her back about an hour later and say, "What's a podcast?" I didn't know, but the learning curve is steep, and the only thing I insisted upon, I wanted to get an income for her, so we wanted to pre-sell it, which is not easy to do in podcast world. And so we eventually, I didn't know there was an ABC audio division, came about after I left, and so we sold it to ABC, and we were able to get 6 appearances on Good Morning America, to be crass, to plug it on GMA, as well as I said, do stories that arose out of the podcast. And so we've been doing it now for, I think we're about to post our 15th podcast, and we've had great guests. We started with Oprah, and we've had guests like John Irving and Anna Quinlan, and really good authors when their books come out. We just did one this week with a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, Mike, an author by the name of Hernan Diaz, who's written a book called Trust, which is a terrific book. And we've had very good books that we've been able to talk about with the authors. And then we've also affiliated ourselves with a number of independent bookstores across the country because we believe in the criticality of independent bookstores. They are a centerpiece of any community. And so we've been putting on an independent bookseller just for the last 4 or 5 minutes of the podcast. each week to talk to them about what's selling, and particularly about regional authors who are so interesting. We just talked to, it hasn't been posted yet, but we talked to an owner of a bookstore in Missoula, Montana, talking about writers who have captured the spirit of that state. It's really been a joy to do it, and working with your daughter it's a lot of work.
You ain't lying.
You can attest to that.
Yes, I can.
The number of contacts you and I have had before doing this has been a lot. Yeah, you were very persistent, and you're very good at what you do.
Thank you.
But booking it and then reading. But we've been very blessed. The publishers have taken a liking to us, and we've been able to get very good authors on. So I've enjoyed it. And as we say, it's available wherever free podcasts are sold. It's minimal cost to the listener.
I'll put the link to it, of course, in the description of this episode, both on the audio and video version. This has been great. It is now time for the concluding segment. It's the rapid fire. 5 hit run questions from me, 5 hit run answers from you. You can say pass if you want. We'll start with the first thing. Most uplifting story you've ever covered?
It's going to take some explanation. A young boy from Rwanda who was a Hutu, I believe, and his bus was hijacked by the other tribe, the Tutsis.
Tutsis, yeah.
And and they cut off his arms and left him to die. And he was found. He was brought. Jack Hanna, who did zoo work for us. Jack is a wonderful guy. He has a group in Columbus, Ohio. They learned about this kid. They brought him to the United States. He got artificial arms, which he had learned to control to some extent. He could even tie his shoes with these artificial arms. They went up to this part of his arm. That's where his arms were cut off. The reason it was such an uplifting story is he met the people who cut off his arms, and he forgave them. That's a young man who and in many respects also, Mike, 9/11, as horrible as it was an uplifting story to me in the aftermath and the way people came together and the way communities, when tragedy hits communities and they band together, those are the uplifting stories. But that boy, and I can't pronounce his name. I can spell it, but I can't pronounce it. Was an incredible kid. He's back now in Rwanda, and I understand he's an artist, an amateur artist. Anyway, great kid.
Yeah, I concur. Second, favorite interview you've ever conducted?
Charles Schulz, Peanuts, the philosopher of our day, and one of the I think greatest Americans ever. And favorite politician to interview, Tip O'Neill, because Tip didn't understand what the hell I was about. He didn't understand politics. About television. He knew politics, but he didn't understand television. He couldn't figure out why television was. He just didn't get it. He was an old time Paul. The story I love about Tip, when they gave him a goodbye dinner, the Democratic Party gave him a goodbye dinner when he retired, and they gave him an airplane to bring down anybody from Cambridge that he wanted to bring down to celebrate with him. And he brought his barber and the guy who ran the liquor store and the druggist and whatever. He was a man of the people.
Third, funniest colleague you've ever had?
I'm sorry?
Funniest colleague you've ever had?
Funniest colleague?
Yes.
Spencer Christian.
Spencer Christian.
So much fun to work with. Spencer had the quickest mind. Oh, I can't tell you some of those stories. They're not fit for broadcast. But Spencer he's a very, very bright man, and yet all he wants to do is have fun, and he's very funny. And working with him just made you laugh every morning.
Fourth, favorite place you've ever traveled to as part of a story?
As part of a story?
Yes.
Favorite place?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I love London. I always used to love going over to talk to prime ministers there, my favorite place to travel now in retirement. My wife and I have gone to sub-Saharan Africa a number of times. I've fallen in love with that area. Fallen in love with going on safari. We've gone, I think, 4 times in the last, well, before COVID, 4 times in the 6 years before COVID. Um, and I so want those countries to make it. There is so much corruption and there are so many problems that they face, um, but they are beautiful countries.
And fifth and finally, knowing what you know now, if you can go back in time and give advice to a young version of Charlie Gibson, what would you tell a young version of Charlie Gibson?
I would if you love something, it's such a Miss America answer, but if you love something and if you really have a passion for it, try to figure out how to make a living at it. Um, I love the news, and I my father engendered this in me, and so I've been so lucky that I didn't get into that YALE law school, and I was able to pursue journalism, and now I'm seeing it in Kate, who has always wanted to do something with books, and and messed around with television production for a while, and she liked it. It was fine, but it wasn't what she really loved. And now she's doing something she really loves with this podcast. Do that. So that's really it. As I say, it's a very cliche piece of advice, but if you love it, do it, and try to figure out a way. I remember, and I'm going way past my time, Mike.
No, you're not. Go ahead.
But I remember one of the seminal conversations of my life. Um, I had started in journalism. I'd done the years in Lynchburg. I'd gone through this time at Channel 7 in Washington, and they came to me. I was anchoring the local news on the weekends at Channel 7, and they came to me and they said, "You're too preppy for television, so we're going to send you off to radio." And I suddenly realized that my elevator, which had been going up till that point, my elevator was going down, and I needed to do something. And I was lucky enough to get a fellowship at the University of Michigan, paid for by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And it was a year to figure out, should I go back to law school? Should I find something else to do? And I said to my wife one night when we were just sitting in the kitchen, I said, I miss it. And but I need to do something else because I probably will never make any money at this. Channel 7 consigned me to radio. I don't know what the future would be if I tried to get back into television journalism, radio journalism. I don't know what it'll, but we'll probably never make much money if I do that. And Arlene said to me, "Do you love it? Do you miss it?" And I said desperately, and she said, "So why are we having this discussion? Do it." And that's empowering when somebody says that to you. And then I've just been so blessed since then. But that conversation was a turning point in my life, and I've been very lucky professionally and obviously very blessed in family with a wife who would say something like that.
I would say this has been wonderful. Don't sign off yet. We'll say goodbye off the air. But besides the podcast, which is again the bookcase with Kate and Charles Gibson, is there anything else? Any shout outs you want to give to anyone or anything?
No. I appreciate it, Mike. You when you first came to me and said we should be doing this, or would I be willing to do this? I thought, yeah, it'd be fun. But then I all of a sudden got into this putting together a podcast business, and that became the sole focus. I really appreciate that you were persistent in calling and asking, and this has been a pleasure. And I wish you great success with this. So my only shout out is to you.
Oh, thank you very much. That means a lot. Shout out, of course, to everybody who tuned in today. I'll try to make sure I don't miss anybody. Jay Driscoll, D. True, Stephen Soslavsky, retired NYPD first grade hostage negotiation team detective Christian Flood, Joe Maliga, retired NYPD first grade arson explosion squad detective Bill Ryan, Ruth Ann Griffin, Andy's randomness, and anybody else I might have missed in there. Oh, Steve O, retired NYPD lieutenant. Thank you guys for tuning in. Of course, it is matinee. Now, it's not the only show today. Coming up tonight on the Mike the New Haven podcast, you might remember this story, Charlie. It was a bomb plot against the Atlantic Avenue subway, but thanks to the emergency service unit of the NYPD and the bomb squad, it was thwarted back in 1997. And tonight, I speak with the men who were there: retired NYPD emergency service unit detectives Joe Dolan and Dave Martinez, bomb squad detectives Paul Yerkou and Rich Teamsma, and arson explosion squad sergeant Fred Manzalillo will join me for volume 26 of Tales from the Boom Room, profiles of the NYPD's bomb squad, the 1997 Atlantic Avenue pipe bomb plot. So be there at 7 o'clock tonight. That should be a great show. In the meantime, on behalf of Charles Gibson, I'm Mike Colón. Take care of yourselves, refresh yourselves, have a lunch if you haven't yet, and I'll see you later at 7. Take care.